Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today I want to show you how to make this fabulous quilt right here. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today we are going to make this beautiful quilt, which I'm calling the Faux Cathedral Windows. It was originally called the Easy Cathedral Windows, but then I had the brilliant idea of putting these small cathedral windows in between the larger ones. So that turned it from easy to something just a little bit more complicated. But the effort is worth it, and I hope you'll stick with me and give this one a try. But don't worry, if this one's a little intimidating, I do have an easy cathedral windows, and that video will come up in a couple of weeks. So let's dive right in.
The inspiration for this project came when I saw this Instagram video and this creator. I was completely captivated by this and couldn't quite imagine what it was that they were doing. It was a one seam flying geese tutorial. And I'm watching and I'm watching and I'm thinking, this is so clever. This is so creative. But what really blew my mind is when she did a second one and then joined them together. And then just watch as she folds these edges over. This is when my mind went, oh my gosh, we can do cathedral windows like this. So beautiful. And that's the inspiration for this project.
So based on my very successful test, I decided that I wanted to stay with the black background, and I remembered that I had some leftover Cafe facet prints. These are left over from my very sunshiny curved piecing project, and I'll put a little photo in here to show you what the original project was for these pieces. These are 2.5 inch strips, and there's 20 of them from each of the fat quarters that I had in that Cafe facet collection. And with this being resized to 2.5 inches, I thought that would be an amazing way to use these. There are 20 of them. I will be able to get, I think, 40 blocks. I think I'll be able to get two blocks out of each strip. So I'll be able to get 40 blocks out of these pieces, but that's really not enough for whatever project this is going to turn into. So then I went to the collection and decided that I would pull out everything that might coordinate with these K facet prints. So I've got some amazing oranges and yellows, some of which I used in some of my Elizabeth Hartman projects. I've got some cute reds and pinks that I'm going to throw in as well. More oranges, lots of oranges. I seem to have a thing for orange, I guess. Lots of these great oranges. This, oh, gosh, I'm going to use a piece of this. I've had this fabric forever, and it is one of my all-time favorite fabrics, but I think it's probably time to cut a few pieces from it and use it up. And there's lots of others. There's some Tula pink in here. This just screams Mexican to me, and I think it's actually called Fiesta from Connecting Threads. Little piece of batik, some more of that yellow we saw earlier. So I think just lots of fabrics that will coordinate with these K facet prints. I also found a little stack of charm squares from Moda. I don't know how old these are, but they've been around for a long time. And as I flip through, I think that there is some oranges and yellows and pinks in the back here that will also coordinate. So I think that there's enough here, along with the black, to really dive into a fun and exciting, easy cathedral windows project. So let's get cutting and let's get to it. The cutting for this is really quite simple. I've got my sample block here as the example. You essentially need two 4.5 by 2.5 inch bricks and 4 background pieces. In my case, I'm using black, and so they are 2.5 inch square. So all of those pieces will make one block. Each unit is made up of 2 background pieces and a brick. So if you're using scraps to make one block, look the same, to have the same window in your block, you do need two pieces that match in order to make this work. So like many of my projects, I've cut a bunch of fabrics here. I'm not exactly sure how big a project I'm aiming for or exactly how many pieces I'm going to need, but I'll sort that out as part of the design process. And the final pattern, which you'll be able to get off my website at www.bitsandpiecesquilting.com, will have all the final numbers of blocks to cut, yardage of fabric that you'll need in order to make the example that'll show up eventually on the front of the pattern. So make sure to check that out. But I'll update you on the numbers as we go through the video. The Instagram video shows you how to sew these together, and it's quite simple. For each unit, as I said, you need 2 background squares and 1 accent fabric or color fabric. This gets folded wrong sides together, and then the edges, the open edges, get lined up on the bottom of your background fabric. So you have this little gap here, and then the other piece goes right on top. So your little sandwich has the folded edge at the top, your 2 background pieces. If your background fabric was printed or patterned, you would want right sides together. But because I have this black, it doesn't matter. But if it were printed, you would have the right sides all touching each other. And then I will take it to the machine and I will sew down this seam right here. So catch that folded edge to the end. And that's it. You just make lots and lots and lots of these. So I'm going to go do that now and then show you the next step to put the blocks together. These are all the pieces that I've sewn, and let me show you again how I've put them together. I have the folded 4.5-inch brick in between my 2 background squares, and I've sewn down along this side. They almost look like a little book to me with this little folded edge. And then we take these over to the ironing board, and that's where the magic is going to happen. We're going to open these up, press them properly, and this folded piece then is going to magically come down and make our flying geese unit. It's really cool. The first time I saw it on Instagram, I was completely blown away by the magic of it all. In order to press it, you have a couple of options. One option is to take a really fine pointed pair of scissors. My normal sewing scissors are just too blunt, but I have these really delicate ones, and snip this little folded edge right in here. Snip this folded edge right up to your seam. Oops, it's hard to see. There we go. That's one option, and that will let you then press this seam open, which is my preferred approach. If you don't want to take the time to clip all those tiny little seams, another option is to open this seam up, and I highly recommend you press these seams flat, and then just make a little tiny triangle hat with this little piece if you don't want to snip like this. And then finally, the third option is to press your printed fabric to one side. So still press your seam open, but press that printed fabric to one side. What I would then do is find its pair and press the printed fabric on the other one to the opposite side to let you nest your seams. But let's take these over to the ironing board and I will show you what they look like when they're pressed. So here we are at my dirty ironing board, and let me show you how to press all 3 of these. These ones are the ones where I have clipped this little seam here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just finger press this open. And I'm just going to run my fingernail along that inside seam, inside the little folded spot of the printed fabric. And I've made a few of these already, and it's just so magical the way that this folds out into a perfect flying goose unit with these little loose tails. And you can see on the back, I've just pressed it open with that seam trimmed, or that seam clipped. And so this is the matching one with the clipped seam. I'm going to just quickly finger press it on the inside with my fingernail, just to make it a little bit easier, so that on the front I can lay it down, lay it out properly, and press it down with the iron, like that. To sew these together, I'd line up these two seams on both sides, maybe put a clip there, maybe put a pin, and then run that underneath the sewing machine. The second option is to just fold down a tiny little hat here. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to run my fingernail inside and outside to get that seam nice and flat, and just fold that little peak down so that the whole thing is flat. Flip this over, line everything up properly, and give it a nice little press, so that you have that tiny little hat there. I'm going to do the same thing with its twin. Press it nice and flat with my fingernail, flip it over, lay it down properly, and give it a press. Actually, it's not its twin. I thought they were matching, but if they were matching, I would sew those together. I will find those twins later. And then the third option, and my least preferred option, is to press the printed fabric to one side. So in this instance, I'm going to press this off to the left, like this. And then in its twin, in its partner, I would press it off to the right. So let's do that. So you can see the printed fabric is pressed to the left, and in its twin, because I'm going to want to be able to nest these fabrics together, I'm going to press the fabric to the right, like that. Let me just lay this down and press it. It saves you having to do the clipping, but the clipping is very much my preferred approach. So you can see pressed to the left and pressed to the right. And then when we go to lay these together, oops, okay, did that completely wrong. Obviously, because we're flipping it right side down and upside down, you would need to press it to the same side so that you could nest those seams together. Let me just press that quickly. Big mistake there. Obviously not my preferred method because I hadn't actually tested this before filming. But there you go. So that would then let you lay those together and try and nest those seams somewhat. But you're still dealing with multiple layers of fabric here. So you don't really feel the nest the way that you normally do when you press seams to one side. So my preferred approach is here with that slight clip. And now we'll take these over to the sewing machine and sew them together. So to sew these together, you want to match these up as best you can. I'm just eyeballing it like this. You can use a pin or a clip if you'd like, or you can just hold them together. Another way to double check is to make sure your points are lined up and your background bits are lined up. I'm not much for pinning or clipping, so I'm happy with that. And then I'm going to just run it under the machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be careful here because for most of this, you're going through 6 layers of fabric. My machine is powerful enough to do that, but you might just want to take your time and not force your machine through this too quickly. So let's do that one more time. I have 2 pairs, or sorry, 1 pair, 2 units. I'm going to line up those seams as best I can, put a little clip in the middle, double check that the corners and the edges of my background fabric are nicely lined up, and then slide this under the machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let me just clip these apart and we can see how we've done. We open these up. That's not bad at all. You can see the corners meet quite nicely here. And then we have that seam down the center. And on the other one, not too bad at all. I'm going to take these back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to press these seams open again. I want this final project to lay as flat as possible. And because of all of these layers of fabric, I don't want to press the seam to one side or the other. I want to press it open. So I'll take those over to the machine and do that. But I have a couple here that I did earlier with the seams pressed open. And so now the next step is to turn these into a cathedral window. And this is so much fun. So let's see if we can get the camera in here nice and close, and I'll show you how to do this. So these are bias edges, and so they just naturally fold over into a cathedral window like this. It doesn't take much just to fold that over, and that's where the fabric wants to lay. It's really hard to make it wider because then it starts to pull on your background fabric. And I guess it's okay to make it skinnier, but you want to basically make it as wide as it seems natural for the fabric to lay down. And to start, I'm going to start in the seam. I don't want to start on one of these edges. The seam tells me where to start my stitching. And I'm lucky with my machine that my presser foot, the inside edge here of my presser foot, between that and the needle, is a really good guide to go along the edge of this folded bit for my top stitching. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to put my presser foot down and very slowly start my needle. And then, as I said, the inside edge of my presser foot here, this inside edge, and this inside edge of the fabric is where I'm going to run my top stitch. And just do a quarter at a time. Take your time, feed the unit through that curve underneath your presser foot, and then pause when you get to the corner, like that. Spin your work, fold the next cathedral window bit, fold the next biased edge, put your presser foot down, and sew. Catch those corners, catch that edge. Take your time, go as slow or as quickly as you feel comfortable. Turn again for the next edge. Follow along. You can also do this by hand if you'd like. That would take a long time, but it might be very, very soothing and methodical to sit perhaps in front of a good movie and hand sew these. I'm very, very happy to do them by machine. And you can see here I have a medium gray thread. I have so many different colors in all of these blocks that I'm actually just too darn lazy to change from yellow thread to orange thread to pink thread. And so I'm just using this medium gray across the entire project, and I'm happy with the slight contrast. I think it's neutral enough to carry the day for these squares. And then when you get to the end, just tack it down a stitch or two. So I'll trim this thread, and that is your cathedral windows unit. On the back, you can see where I've got the seams pressed open, and then these stitch lines have come through, and that will hold that those seams pressed open, and it'll be pretty flat in the final project. As I was making these blocks, I knew that they would finish at 4 inches in the quilt. These are 4.5 inches square unfinished because I have two 2.5 inch squares sewn together, which gives me 4.5 inches unfinished and 4 inches in the final quilt. And given the amount of work and the amount of fabric and the weight, I decided that I was going to start by making 140 blocks. That would give me a 10 by 14 layout. And then I figured I would add borders and maybe a couple, like a darker border and then maybe a bright border and then a few other things just to end up to be about 50 by 60 in the end, or 50 by 70 in the end. So I laid all of these blocks out on the bed in the spare room, and I thought the 11 by 14, sorry, the 10 by 14 looked a little weird. So I changed my mind and went with 11 by 13, which looked more proportional to me. but that means I needed 143 blocks. So I ran back into the sewing room and made 3 more blocks. And then I laid them out and I thought, this is not the focal point. These black circles, this isn't the focal point that I'm trying to achieve. And so I started to think about how I could put another cathedral window or a faux cathedral window into this space. And I got thinking about it and I thought, well, I would just cut another 2.5 by 4.5 inch piece like these and put it in here. And then I could do the 4Zs, make 4 like this, and then sew those together. But the more I got to thinking about it, the more that this project has snowballed to be a lot more complex than that. Because a cathedral window that's exactly this size won't fit here. These pieces, because of the seam allowance, are too big. So I thought, all right, I have to make the cathedral window that goes into here a little bit smaller. How would I do that? These are cut 2.5 by 4.5, and I realized that I could rescale these pieces to become 2 inches by 3.5 inches. That would give me a smaller window and still allow the black to show through and not interfere with the seam allowance. And then I thought, well, perfect, I'll make 4Zs and then start to sew the 4Zs together. But then I got to thinking, no, that's not going to work either, because if I'm going to put this together, I need the bottom half of this window and the top half of this window. And then before I add anything else, I also need to consider this window and this window and this window, and it all snowballed from there to the point where I realized I would actually have to lay out the entire 11 by 13 in order to make this work. And then I started to think about it a little bit more and realized that I had to plan the next row before completing the current row. So I didn't have to lay out exactly all 13 rows, but I did need to lay out all 10, or at least plan what this window was going to be before starting to sew the rows together. So that has been an adventure and it has been incredibly time consuming, but it looks so good. I'm so pleased. So I have some photos, some still photos that I'll insert in here of me laying all of this out on the floor, because all of these pieces have to be pre-planned before I can start to sew the rows together. So ultimately what will happen is to sew, if this is the start of 2 rows, and then of course it goes out by 10 blocks in this direction, I've decided that this is going to be the window that's going to go here. This will be the window that goes here. These will match the row above, and on we go. And so to sew these together, what I need to do, the same way that we were making these, fold them, lay that in there. Let me grab a couple of clips so I can show you what I've been doing. I've been clipping them together. So fold both of these, put the folded edge to the bottom of the block, and then to get it to line up properly, I've actually been clipping these in place just like this. Then taking this one, folding it over, lining up the points so that they are nice and well matched, putting a clip in here, and then re-clipping these into place so that those folded pieces of fabric are where they need to be. Now, for somebody who doesn't pin at all, 3 clips just to sew a 4.5 inch piece of fabric together is extreme for me. But I found I had to do this in order to get everything to line up properly. And then imagine that sewn, and then these will open up the same way that just the single block opens up. And then if we go on to the next one, these need to be folded and put into here like this. And these fish, I love these fish, like this, and on down the row. And so I have been taking it from the floor of my sewing room, clipping it all together down the row, sewing the rows together. And then once you have the rows completely sewn together, let me show you what those look like. It's quite the adventure. So this is what a row looks like. I have all of these pieces that were originally folded like this and pinned just the way I showed you. But then once I press it, I have pressed the seams open, pressed these nice and flat, and then they get lined up with their next row. Let me show you this one. So this is now 2 rows sewn together, and you can see I've put this under the machine and folded these smaller cathedral windows over to get those curved edges. I think it looks fantastic, but wow, it's been a lot of work. So while I've been working on this, I've also been starting to think of a way to do this faster and easier. It's not going to have the same drama, perhaps, but this has been a labor of love and it's incredibly heavy. There's a lot of fabric in here, but I think it is looking really, really good. This row will now get added here, and you can see where the planning has paid off because now these will all get sewn together, and once sewn together, these edges will get folded over to become the windows just like this. And then the same here, the row that gets added there. So I've been doing it in pieces, and very soon I will have all 10 by 13 rows, 143 cathedral windows sewn together with, gosh, probably 9 by 12. So whatever math that is, smaller windows to join them all together. Let me get back to work and I'll show you what this looks like when we get there.
Once the rows are sewn together, I took the opportunity to fold over the cathedral window edges between each row, just so I had much less bulk to maneuver underneath the sewing machine. And as you can see here, I am folding those edges over exactly the same way that I did the larger window blocks. This is just a tiny bit more challenging just because there's those extra pieces to navigate. And so you can see as I'm spinning it around, I have to bring all of that around with me. But by doing it between every single row before I sewed those larger rows together, it really wasn't that difficult. And even the last row took a moment or two, but because I had done so many like this, it really wasn't that hard to do these small little windows. And so before I show you the final reveal of the entire quilt complete, I thought I'd show you this quick shot of what the back looks like with all those seams pressed open, and then all of the stitching to stitch down the cathedral windows. The back sometimes is just as fascinating as the front, but as you can see from the front, it has turned out really, really beautifully. It's a riot of color, and I've added some kind of calming borders, maybe, with a little bit of black just to set it off, and then a final border just to finish the final project.
Thanks very much for watching this video on the faux cathedral windows. I hope you enjoyed it. The effort is worth it and the results are spectacular. I hope you'll give this a try. You can get the pattern from my website at www.bitsandpiecesquilting.com. Thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.